The operating room doors burst open, just as the cardiac monitor screamed a warning that cut through the surgical wing like a blade, and every nurse in the corridor turned toward the sound with the same terrified thought. The chief surgeon had not arrived. The patient on the table, a respected school principal who had collapsed without warning during what was supposed to be a routine heart procedure, had only minutes left before the damage became irreversible. Residents exchanged anxious glances, while senior physicians argued in clipped voices over whether they should attempt to stabilize the patient or wait for the hospital's most celebrated surgeon to take command. Every second spent debating carried the weight of another heartbeat slipping away. Then someone quietly said the words that made the room fall into stunned silence. The surgery had already begun. Inside operating room 7, beneath lights so bright they erased every shadow, a lone figure stood at the operating table with remarkable stillness. The young resident's hands moved with careful precision, neither rushed nor hesitant, as though the impossible scene unfolding before everyone else was simply another responsibility that had arrived on an ordinary morning. Sweat gathered beneath the surgical cap, but the gloved fingers never trembled. Around the resident stood nurses and anesthesiologists whose faces revealed equal parts fear and reluctant trust. None of them had expected to be following the lead of someone whose identification badge still carried the modest title of junior resident. Yet as each instruction came calmly across the sterile room, they obeyed almost without thinking. The patient's blood pressure remained dangerously unstable, but the incision was clean, the instruments requested before anyone anticipated them, and every movement suggested a confidence earned somewhere far beyond the hospital's residency program. Outside, the elevators finally opened. Chief Surgeon Daniel Mercer stepped out, surrounded by assistants already apologizing for the chain of delays that had trapped him across the city after a highway accident blocked emergency transport. His reputation had been built over 3 decades of impossible recoveries, and within these walls many believed there was no operation too difficult for him to conquer. Nurses instinctively stepped aside as he hurried toward the operating suite, still fastening his surgical gown while demanding updates. The answers only deepened the confusion. The patient's condition had deteriorated faster than expected. Cardiac rupture, massive internal bleeding, survival odds nearly non-existent. Then came the final report. Someone had initiated the repair before his arrival. Daniel stopped walking. His expression hardened. "Who authorized that?" he demanded. Nobody answered immediately. The silence itself became its own confession. Finally, one trembling resident spoke barely above a whisper. "The junior did." Daniel's jaw tightened. Years of discipline barely concealed the anger rising beneath his calm exterior. A junior resident did not perform catastrophic cardiac reconstruction. They observed. They assisted. They learned. They certainly did not decide to begin one of the most complex procedures in modern surgery without the chief present. He pushed through the operating room doors expecting chaos, expecting uncontrolled bleeding, expecting irreversible mistakes that would haunt careers forever. Instead, he found something that completely disrupted every assumption he carried into the room. The operating field was astonishingly organized. Every instrument rested exactly where it should. Blood loss remained surprisingly controlled despite the severity of the injury. The anesthesiologist's breathing had slowed, no longer panicked, but intensely focused. Even the circulating nurses moved with unusual confidence, because the person leading them never wasted a single instruction. Daniel looked toward the operating table. The resident did not even glance up. Eyes remained fixed entirely upon the patient's heart, following each tiny movement beneath magnification with extraordinary concentration. "Clamp," the resident said softly. The instrument arrived before the final syllable finished. "Suction. Already there. 3.8 proline." Waiting in an open hand. Every request anticipated. Every motion efficient. Daniel had spent enough years inside operating rooms to recognize genuine mastery when he saw it. And what unsettled him most was not merely the technical precision. It was the rhythm. Surgery possessed a rhythm impossible to fake. Experienced surgeons developed it over decades until movements became almost musical, each action flowing naturally into the next. This resident possessed that rhythm. Daniel stepped closer without interrupting. The incision lines were nearly perfect. The vascular repair demonstrated techniques rarely attempted outside elite international centers. A subtle, nodding method caught his attention. It was old-fashioned, almost forgotten, but astonishingly secure. Very few surgeons still practiced it. His eyes narrowed. Where had this resident learned that? Across the room, Nurse Evelyn noticed Daniel studying the procedure instead of taking over. She had worked beside him for nearly 20 years and recognized the rare expression crossing his face. It was not anger anymore. It was confusion. Genuine confusion. The monitors suddenly changed tone. Blood pressure dropped again. The patient's heart quivered dangerously. Every pair of eyes shifted toward the screen. For one suspended moment, nobody breathed. Daniel instinctively reached forward, prepared to assume control. Before his hands entered the field, the resident quietly adjusted the retractor by less than an inch, altered the angle of one suture, and compressed a tiny vessel almost invisible beneath the surrounding tissue. The monitor responded immediately. Blood pressure climbed. Heart rhythm steadied. Color slowly returned to the patient's exposed muscle. Nobody spoke. The silence that followed carried more weight than applause ever could. Daniel slowly withdrew his hands. Around him, seasoned professionals realized they had just witnessed a correction so subtle that many accomplished surgeons would never have recognized the problem until it was too late. The resident finally spoke without lifting tired eyes from the patient. "We're not safe yet. There's another tear beneath the posterior wall. If we miss it now, he'll bleed internally within minutes after closure." Daniel looked toward the damaged heart, searching for the injury. At first he saw nothing. Then, after several seconds, he found it. Hidden almost perfectly beneath healthy tissue lay the tiny rupture the resident had somehow detected before anyone else. A cold realization settled over the chief surgeon. Whoever stood beside the operating table was not relying on luck. This was knowledge. Deep, disciplined, hard-earned knowledge. As another nurse hurried to retrieve additional instruments, Daniel's gaze briefly landed on a small notebook partially visible inside the open locker, just beyond the operating room entrance. Its worn leather cover marked by years of careful handling. Something about it stirred a distant memory he could not immediately place. Before he could think further, the resident extended a hand for the next instrument without turning around and said with complete certainty, "We're about to reach the hardest part of the operation." At that exact moment, Daniel realized he no longer knew whether he had arrived in time to save the patient or whether he had just walked into the middle of a mystery far greater than the surgery itself. The operating room settled into an uneasy rhythm that felt almost unnatural after the rush of panic that had filled it only minutes before. Yet everyone present understood that the most dangerous moments still waited ahead. The first crisis had been contained, but now the damaged heart revealed injuries hidden beneath layers of swollen tissue, each one threatening to undo every careful repair that had already been completed. The junior resident leaned slightly closer to the operating field, breathing evenly despite the strain beginning to show beneath tired eyes. Hours of concentration had stiffened every muscle in the shoulders, but the hands remained impossibly steady. Around the table, experienced nurses exchanged brief glances that needed no words. They had each worked beside brilliant surgeons before. This felt different. It was not confidence born from arrogance. It was the quiet certainty of someone who had already accepted responsibility long before anyone else realized it was necessary. Chief Surgeon Daniel Mercer remained opposite the resident, observing every movement with growing disbelief. Pride urged him to reclaim command, yet reason forced him to hesitate. Interrupting flawless work simply because it came from unexpected hands could cost a life. That realization stung more deeply than he cared to admit. For years he had believed hierarchy existed to protect patients. Now hierarchy itself threatened to become the obstacle. The cardiac monitor suddenly accelerated, breaking his thoughts. Blood pressure dipped again. Oxygen saturation slipped. A narrow vessel hidden behind the left ventricle had begun leaking faster than expected. One of the senior surgeons instinctively reached toward the suction device before speaking. "Visibility is collapsing." Another physician quietly muttered that they were losing the field. The junior did not answer immediately. Instead, those calm eyes studied the widening pool of blood as though searching for a pattern invisible to everyone else. Then came a single sentence, spoken almost gently. "Don't chase the bleeding. Find what's forcing it." The words sounded simple, but every experienced surgeon in the room understood the wisdom behind them. Panic tempted surgeons to attack the obvious problem first. Masters searched for the source beneath it. Without wasting another movement, the resident adjusted the heart by a fraction of an inch using only fingertip pressure. The hidden vessel appeared. A delicate clamp followed. The bleeding slowed almost instantly. Nobody celebrated. There was no time. New complications arrived with relentless precision. Scar tissue from an undiagnosed childhood infection wrapped around major arteries like hardened vines, making ordinary repair nearly impossible. The operation had transformed from extraordinarily difficult into something few hospitals would even attempt. Daniel found himself watching the resident's eyes more than the hands now. Every decision arrived several seconds before the danger became visible on the monitors. Anticipation rather than reaction. That was what separated extraordinary surgeons from merely excellent ones. An anesthesiologist quietly announced another warning. Pressure is falling again. This time the decline came faster. The damaged heart began fluttering irregularly. Nurses prepared emergency medications. One resident whispered that they were about to lose him. Then silence settled across the room. It lasted only a handful of seconds. Yet those seconds stretched until they felt almost outside time itself. Nobody spoke. Nobody reached for another instrument. Even the constant background hum of machines seemed strangely distant. Every pair of eyes remained fixed upon the exposed heart. The only sound was the slow mechanical breathing of the ventilator. In that fragile stillness, the junior lowered one hand, closed tired eyes for the briefest moment, and seemed to remember something learned years ago rather than merely recalling information from a textbook. When those eyes opened again, uncertainty had disappeared completely. "Rotate the field 7 degrees," the resident said softly. Several surgeons exchanged puzzled looks. 7 degrees sounded absurdly specific. Nevertheless, the adjustment was made. Suddenly, the damaged artery aligned perfectly beneath the surgical lights, revealing an angle impossible to see before. The resident smiled almost invisibly. "There you are." What followed unfolded so quickly that several younger doctors struggled to understand what they had witnessed. A sequence of sutures crossed through tissue no wider than a strand of thread. 1 stitch. 2. Pause. Reverse tension. 3rd stitch. Release. Blood flow returned. The heart answered with a stronger contraction. Then another. The monitors climbed together as though awakening from sleep. Relief swept across the room, but Daniel's attention remained fixed elsewhere. That sequence, those exact hand positions, that unusual rotation before repair. He had seen it once before many years earlier during an international surgical conference attended only by a handful of specialists. The technique had never appeared in textbooks because its creator believed it could only be taught directly from mentor to student. Daniel had spent years trying unsuccessfully to reproduce it himself. How could a junior resident perform it with effortless precision? Before he could ask, another complication erupted. The repaired tissue suddenly tore along an unexpected edge, sending fresh bleeding across the operative field. Gasps escaped around the table. Even the nurses who had remained remarkably composed stiffened in alarm. One physician whispered that reopening the previous repair would consume precious minutes the patient no longer possessed. Daniel finally stepped forward. "We need another approach." The resident looked at him for the first time since the operation had begun. There was no challenge in those exhausted eyes, no pride, only calm respect. "There is another approach," the resident replied, "but almost nobody uses it anymore." Without waiting for approval, the junior reached for a different needle entirely, one rarely selected for cardiac reconstruction. The surrounding staff watched in confusion as the suture path curved in an unconventional pattern instead of following modern practice. Daniel's pulse quickened. Memory flooded back with startling clarity. 22 years earlier, inside a teaching theater in Geneva, an elderly surgical pioneer had demonstrated that exact repair while dismissing every accepted convention. Most observers had considered it outdated. Daniel had never forgotten the lecture because the old professor ended with a single sentence. "The safest path is not always the newest one." Sometimes it is simply the one everyone else forgot. Only 3 apprentices had ever trained personally under that legendary surgeon after his retirement. Their identities had never been made public. The resident completed the repair. Bleeding stopped. Stable rhythm returned. Nobody moved. Even the machine seemed quieter now. Then the operating room doors opened gently behind them as the hospital's oldest consulting surgeon, Dr. Miriam Roth, entered after being summoned for assistance. She watched the final, not being tied from several steps away. Her expression changed instantly. She walked closer without speaking until she stood beside Daniel. Her eyes never left the resident's hands. Finally, almost in a whisper that barely reached anyone beyond the operating table, she said, "That stitch belongs to Professor Elias Varga." Daniel turned toward her in disbelief. Dr. Roth nodded slowly, still staring at the flawless repair. He never published it. He refused to teach it except to the last student he believed worthy. The room fell completely silent once more. Every question about the impossible surgery had suddenly become something far greater than hidden talent. Whoever this quiet junior truly was, they carried the final lessons of a legend thought to have vanished from modern medicine. And Daniel realized the greatest mystery inside the hospital had never been the patient fighting for life on the table. It was the anonymous resident who had somehow inherited a legacy that the entire surgical world believed had disappeared forever. The words spoken by Dr. Miriam Roth settled over the operating room with a weight no machine could measure. Nobody questioned her memory. She had practiced surgery for more than 40 years, had trained generations of physicians, and had stood beside some of the greatest names in modern medicine. If she believed those hands belonged to the final student of Professor Elias Varga, then everyone present understood the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Yet the young resident said nothing. There was no attempt to explain, no quiet acknowledgement, not even a flicker of pride. The eyes remained fixed on the patient, as though the conversation taking place only a few feet away belonged to another world entirely. The operation was not finished, and for the resident that was the only truth that mattered. Daniel Mercer felt something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. It was not fear for the patient. It was the uncomfortable realization that certainty could become a dangerous habit. For years he had judged ability by titles, experience by reputation, and leadership by rank. He had built an extraordinary career doing exactly that, rarely questioning the system because the system had rewarded him. Now that same system had nearly prevented the most qualified hands in the room from acting when every second counted. He replayed the morning in his mind, the whispered doubts in the hallway, the hesitation before anyone admitted who had started the procedure. Even his own first reaction had been anger instead of curiosity. The realization settled quietly, but it cut deeply. Across the operating table, another warning tone interrupted the silence. The patient's blood pressure dropped without warning, not sharply this time, but steadily, almost deceptively. The monitors displayed numbers that looked manageable until one noticed they were falling together. The resident leaned closer. Internal compression. Came the calm observation. Something underneath is swelling. One of the senior surgeons frowned. The repairs are holding. Yes, the resident answered. That's why the problem isn't where you're looking. Every head turned toward the exposed heart once again. Daniel searched carefully, following every repaired vessel, every suture line, every section of damaged muscle. Everything appeared stable. Then he remembered something Professor Varga had once demonstrated during that conference decades earlier. Complications often hide beside success because everyone is too busy admiring what has already been fixed. Before he could speak, the resident gently shifted a small section of tissue aside. Beneath it, nearly invisible beneath accumulated fluid, rested a slowly expanding hematoma pressing against the heart itself. It had escaped everyone's attention because it produced no dramatic bleeding. It simply stole space, 1 quiet millimeter at a time. Drain, the resident said softly. The fluid escaped. Pressure eased. The heartbeat strengthened almost immediately. Daniel looked down in disbelief. Had another minute passed, cardiac arrest would likely have followed. Nobody said a word. The silence that filled the room felt different now. It was no longer uncertainty. It was respect. Outside the operating suite, news had already spread throughout the hospital. Nurses paused outside supply rooms, exchanging quiet questions. Residents who had never entered operating room 7 gathered around hallway monitors, hoping for updates. Rumors multiplied with astonishing speed. Some claimed the junior had transferred from an elite international hospital. Others insisted military medical experience explained the impossible composure. A few believed the entire story had been exaggerated. None of them knew the truth. Inside the room, the operation entered its final reconstruction phase. Hours had passed. Every person standing beneath the surgical lights felt exhaustion pressing into aching backs and stiff shoulders. The residents' gloves were stained despite repeated irrigation. Tiny tremors threatened tired muscles between movements. Yet every time the hands returned above the patient, they became perfectly still again. Daniel noticed the change and quietly asked, "How long have you been standing?" "Long enough," the resident replied with a faint smile. "The patient has been waiting longer." It was such a simple answer that nobody responded. There was nothing to add. As the final repair approached, Dr. Miriam Roth continued watching with growing emotion. At last she spoke, not to the resident but to Daniel. "You remember why Professor Varga disappeared, don't you?" Daniel nodded slowly. Officially, the legendary surgeon had retired after the death of his only daughter. Newspapers had written about burnout, grief, and declining health. Then he vanished completely. Invitations went unanswered. Interviews stopped. His methods gradually faded from hospitals around the world until they became little more than stories shared by older physicians. Most people believed he stopped teaching. Miriam whispered. They were wrong. Daniel looked toward the resident. Understanding began forming before the explanation arrived. The resident finally spoke while continuing the repair. "My mother worked as his home nurse during his final years." The room became perfectly still again. She cared for him after everyone else had moved on. Another stitch. Another precise knot. "I used to wait for her after school." The resident's voice remained calm, almost distant, as though describing someone else's life. "He noticed I spent hours reading anatomy books instead of playing outside." A careful adjustment of the suture followed. Eventually, he started asking questions. The monitors continued their steady rhythm while every person listened without interrupting. Then he began teaching. Daniel could almost picture the scenes unfolding years earlier. A lonely old master carrying knowledge the world believed lost. A curious child arriving every afternoon with worn textbooks and endless questions. No cameras, no conferences, no recognition. Just quiet lessons shared between two people whose lives had crossed because of kindness rather than ambition. He never wanted another famous student, the resident continued. He wanted someone who would remember that surgery isn't about proving how much you know. It's about protecting someone who can't protect themselves. Nobody answered. There was nothing anyone could say that would improve those words. The final sutures approached. Then, without warning, the patient's heart shuddered violently. Alarms erupted. Ventricular fibrillation flashed across every monitor. The carefully restored rhythm dissolved into chaos. Nurses rushed medications into position. Defibrillator paddles appeared almost instantly. One resident whispered, "We're losing him." Then everything stopped. Not the machines. Not the alarms. The people. For one suspended moment, every hand froze. Every eye turned toward the resident. The room waited. The junior stepped forward, resting 2 fingers lightly against the repaired heart before quietly saying, "Not yet." Instead of reaching immediately for the defibrillator, the resident performed one final maneuver, gently releasing a minute strand of constricting tissue that had remained hidden beneath the reconstruction. The effect was almost miraculous. The heart contracted once, then again, stronger. The chaotic rhythm slowly organized itself until a steady beat echoed through the operating room once more. Relief swept across exhausted faces. Several nurses quietly wiped tears they had not realized were falling. Daniel closed his eyes for only a second before opening them again with a completely different expression than the one he had carried into the room that morning. Admiration had replaced certainty. Humility had replaced authority. As the surgical team prepared to close the incision, Daniel noticed something tucked inside the resident's open locker beyond the operating room doors. The worn leather notebook had slipped partly open, revealing a faded handwritten inscription on its first page. Even from where he stood, he could clearly read the final line written in elegant, aging script. To my last student, when your hands are steady enough to save a stranger without needing your name remembered, then you will finally understand what it means to become a surgeon. Daniel's breath caught. At that moment he understood that the greatest lesson Professor Elias Varga had left behind was never hidden inside a forgotten technique or an impossible operation. It had been quietly living for years inside the very person everyone in the hospital had overlooked, and when the operating room doors finally opened, he realized the hardest conversation of the day was no longer about saving a life, but about explaining why true greatness had been standing unnoticed in their halls all along. Morning sunlight filtered through the hospital's tall windows long after the impossible surgery had ended, painting quiet bands of gold across polished floors that only hours earlier had carried the frantic footsteps of physicians racing against time. The emergency alarms had fallen silent. Machines now hummed with the calm rhythm of recovery instead of crisis. Inside the intensive care unit, the patient rested peacefully, surrounded by careful observation and the steady hope that accompanies every heartbeat earned through extraordinary effort. Family members stood just outside the glass, their faces exhausted from fear, yet softened by gratitude. They did not know every technical decision that had saved the life of the man they loved. They only knew that someone inside those operating rooms had refused to surrender when surrender would have been the easier choice. Sometimes survival arrives so quietly that those who receive it never fully understand how close they came to disappearing forever. Throughout the hospital, conversations unfolded in hushed voices. Residents replayed every rumor they had heard. Nurses exchanged stories about the operation that already sounded too remarkable to be true. Senior physicians reviewed records repeatedly, searching for some overlooked explanation that would make the events of the previous night fit comfortably inside everything they believed about medicine. None of them found one. Excellence had walked through familiar hallways, wearing an ordinary identification badge, and almost nobody had recognized it until circumstances removed every other option. Late that afternoon, the surgical department gathered inside the hospital's conference room for the mandatory postoperative review. These meetings were normally clinical, detached, and devoted to careful analysis rather than emotion. Complications were examined, decisions were questioned, outcomes were measured with professional honesty. Yet as the room slowly filled, everyone sensed that this meeting would become something different. At the front of the room stood Chief Surgeon Daniel Mercer, a man whose reputation had always rested upon confidence, precision, and certainty. Today something about him seemed quieter, less guarded. He waited until every seat had been filled before opening the patient's chart. No one interrupted. No whispered conversations lingered. The silence itself carried respect. Daniel reviewed each stage of the operation with remarkable honesty, describing every complication exactly as it had occurred. Massive cardiac rupture, hidden vascular injury, posterior wall tear, undetected hematoma, ventricular fibrillation. Every obstacle that should have ended the patient's life had instead become another chapter in an operation that many believed would someday be studied in medical schools. When he reached the final page of the report, Daniel closed the folder and looked slowly across the room. His eyes settled upon the junior resident, sitting quietly near the back, still wearing the same modest identification badge, saying nothing, expecting nothing. Daniel asked the question everyone had been waiting to hear. Who completed the impossible portions of yesterday's surgery? For a brief moment nobody answered. Then Dr. Miriam Roth smiled gently before speaking the simplest words in the room. Just the junior. The sentence seemed almost too small for everything it contained. There was no dramatic introduction, no list of achievements, no announcement of hidden awards or prestigious appointments. Simply the truth. Just the junior. A quiet resident who had spent months closing incisions after senior physicians finished, organizing surgical trays before dawn, studying long after others had gone home, accepting overlooked assignments without complaint, and carrying inside a worn leather notebook the final lessons of a forgotten master. Daniel looked toward the room before speaking again. Yesterday I believed experience belonged only to those with titles. His voice remained calm, but every word carried unmistakable sincerity. Yesterday, I nearly allowed my assumptions to become more dangerous than the disease itself. Nobody shifted in their seats. Every person listened. I have spent years teaching that surgery demands humility. He paused briefly before continuing. Yesterday, a junior resident reminded me that humility must also belong to those doing the teaching. The room remained silent, not because people lacked words, but because they understood they were witnessing something rarer than professional recognition. They were watching genuine accountability. Daniel turned toward the resident. "Would you please stand?" The junior hesitated before quietly rising. There was visible discomfort in becoming the center of attention. The eyes lowered slightly, almost hoping the moment would pass quickly. Daniel smiled. "Professor Elias Varga once changed medicine with his hands," he said softly. "Yesterday I realized his greatest achievement was not a surgical technique. It was choosing the right person to carry those hands into the future." The resident shook the head gently. "He chose kindness first," came the quiet reply. "The techniques came later." A faint smile appeared across several faces in the room. Even now, after accomplishing what few surgeons alive could have achieved, the resident redirected every compliment toward the teacher who had shaped a lifetime. Daniel understood something then that no textbook had ever explained. Greatness does not grow louder as it becomes greater. It grows quieter because it no longer needs to convince anyone it exists. After the meeting concluded, reporters who had heard fragments of the story gathered outside the hospital, hoping to interview the mysterious resident responsible for the impossible surgery. They waited beside entrances with cameras prepared, eager to attach a face to the remarkable headlines already beginning to spread. But the junior never appeared. Instead, while journalists watched the main lobby, the resident quietly returned through a side corridor, carrying a fresh patient file. Another operation required assistance. Another frightened family needed reassurance. Another ordinary day had already begun. Hours later, Daniel found the resident preparing surgical instruments for the following morning exactly as before, carefully arranging every tray with patient attention to detail. Nothing had changed. The notebook rested beside the locker, its leather cover worn smooth by years of faithful use. Daniel walked over and gently placed his own chief surgeon's badge upon the table for a moment before speaking. "I spent too many years believing leadership meant standing in front." The resident looked up. Daniel smiled warmly. "Thank you for reminding me that sometimes leadership begins by standing beside someone instead." The resident answered with the same quiet expression carried throughout the entire ordeal. "The patient survived because everyone stayed." Daniel nodded slowly. The words were true. The nurses who trusted unfamiliar instructions. The anesthesiologist who anticipated every change. Dr. Miriam Roth, who recognized forgotten wisdom. Every physician who chose the patient's life above personal pride. Heroism had never belonged to one person alone. As evening settled over the city, the recovering patient finally opened tired eyes inside the intensive care unit. Family members rushed close, tears filling the room with relieved laughter that no machine could ever imitate. Through the observation window, the junior paused only long enough to see the reunion before quietly walking away toward another, waiting responsibility. No applause followed. No cameras captured the moment. Only one elderly family member happened to glance into the hallway and meet the resident's eyes for a single grateful second. It was enough. Professor Varga's notebook remained safely tucked beneath one arm as the elevator doors slowly closed. Written inside its first page were the words that had guided every decision made beneath the operating lights, words that now seemed to belong not only to one surgeon, but to everyone fortunate enough to witness the truth they carried. The steadiest hands are often the ones nobody thinks to applaud until they have already saved a life. And perhaps that is why the world is changed most often not by those who seek to be remembered, but by those who quietly refuse to let someone else be forgotten. If this story stayed with you, remember the unseen people whose quiet courage shapes lives every day, because somewhere nearby another ordinary face may already be carrying an extraordinary kindness that the world has not yet learned to recognize.